The date was March 18, 1945. The location was the sodden, dispiriting flatlands west of the Rhine River, near the German city of Viersen. The war in Europe had ground on for nearly 6 years, and the Allied forces stood poised at the final natural barrier protecting the heart of the Third Reich. For the United States Ninth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General William Simpson, the objective was singular and terrifying: cross the Rhine, breach the Ruhr, and strangle the German industrial machine. But a river crossing of this magnitude, involving tens of thousands of men, heavy armor, and bridging equipment, was a logistical behemoth that could not be hidden. It was a maneuver vulnerable to catastrophic disruption if the enemy could pinpoint the Schwerpunkt, the point of maximum effort. In the command tent of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the static hum of radio receivers. Colonel Harry L. Reeder, a man whose military lineage traced back through the muddy trenches of the First World War, stood over a map table that detailed a fiction he was charged to make real. Reeder was the commander of the Ghost Army, a unit that existed on paper as a formidable force but on the ground as a collection of rubber, wire, and audacity. His orders for Operation Viersen were unequivocal yet paradoxically impossible for a standard military mind to process. He was to simulate the concentration of 2 full infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th, along with attached armored and engineering elements. He was to convince the German High Command, specifically the intelligence officers of the Fremde Heer West, Foreign Armies West, that the massive blow of the Ninth Army would land here at Viersen, approximately 10 miles south of the actual crossing site. Reeder adjusted his glasses looking at the deployment schedules. He did not have 40,000 men. He had barely 100. He did not have hundreds of Sherman tanks and Long Tom artillery pieces. He had inflatable balloons and flash canisters. He did not have a mechanized corps. He had a collection of artists, sound engineers, and radio operators who were about to scream their presence to the enemy in a calculated attempt to draw fire upon themselves. The movement into the Viersen sector began under the cloak of a dreary March twilight. To the casual observer, and more importantly to the German stay-behind agents and reconnaissance patrols, the roads appeared choked with the vanguard of a major assault. Trucks roared through the mud, their engines straining under heavy loads. Convoys stretched for miles. But inside the trucks of the 23rd, the reality was starkly different. The vehicles were not carrying ammunition or rations. They were packed with deflated neoprene skins, air compressors, and massive amplifiers. The soldiers in the back were not hardening themselves for a bayonet charge. They were checking the valves on dummy tanks and reviewing the scripts for radio plays they would broadcast into the ether. Colonel Reeder's challenge was one of choreography. To simulate 2 divisions, his men had to occupy a frontage that would normally hold 20 times their number. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, the visual deception arm of his unit, began the arduous task of building the army. In the darkening fields around Anrath and Dulken, teams of camoufleurs wrestled with 93-pound bundles of rubberized canvas. Connected to portable compressors, these bundles expanded, unfolding like grotesque flowers into the shapes of M4 Sherman tanks, 2.5-ton trucks, and 155mm artillery pieces. The placement was a delicate art. If the dummies were camouflaged too perfectly, the Germans would never see them, and the deception would fail. If they were left entirely in the open, they would look suspicious. Reeder's officers had to find the sweet spot of incompetence, placing the tanks where a hurried, overconfident American commander might place them, partially obscured but visible enough to a high-flying Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane or a pair of binoculars across the river. They used bulldozers from the 406th Engineer Combat Company to carve tracks into the mud leading up to the dummies, erasing the footprints of the men and replacing them with the heavy tread marks of armor. As darkness fully descended, the visual deception became secondary to the sonic one. This was the domain of the 3132nd Signal Service Company. Colonel Reeder authorized the commencement of the sonic program. Along the riverbank, hidden in the tree line, half-tracks equipped with massive speakers, some of the most powerful sound equipment in existence, developed in secrecy by Bell Labs, began their broadcast. The sound was visceral. It was not a recording of static noise, but a multi-track composition of war. The engineers mixed the sounds of heavy trucks gearing down, the clank of steel pontoon bridges being offloaded, the distinct rattle of tank treads on pavement, and the shouting of sergeants directing traffic. To a German listening post across the Rhine, the acoustic signature was unmistakable. A massive engineering effort was underway to bridge the river. Reeder walked the perimeter of his command post, listening to the phantom army he commanded. The sound carried for 15 miles, a low-frequency rumble that vibrated in the chest. It was a siren song, designed to lure the German reserves out of their bunkers and onto the roads leading to Viersen, away from the real landing zones to the north. But Reeder knew the danger of this siren song. It played both ways. By announcing their presence so loudly, they were inviting the Wehrmacht to strike, and, unlike a real division, the Ghost Army had no teeth. If the Germans decided to spoil the attack with a preemptive artillery barrage or a commando raid across the river, Reeder's men had only their wits and a few caliber machine guns to defend themselves. The first night passed with a tense quiet, the only response being the scratch of German probes, but the illusion was just beginning to take hold. The real test would come when the sun rose and the enemy began to react to the bait. Dawn on March 19th brought a cold, gray light to the Rhineland, revealing the extent of Colonel Reeder's army. Hundreds of tanks sat silent in the fields. Fake artillery batteries pointed menacingly toward the east. The visual deception was now vulnerable to the most dangerous critic, the German artillery spotter. The Germans, realizing that a major force was assembling opposite Viersen, began to probe the positions with artillery fire. This was the moment Reeder dreaded. A real tank, when hit by shrapnel, clangs or sparks. A rubber tank deflates. A sagging gun barrel or a tank that ripples in the wind would instantly reveal the ruse. As the first German shells began to walk across the fields, the men of the 603rd did not seek cover. They grabbed repair kits, patches of rubber and tubes of glue, and sprinted toward the wounded tanks. Under active fire, they worked frantically to patch holes in the decoys, keeping the pressure up so the tanks would maintain their shape. It was a surreal form of bravery, risking one's life to save a balloon. Reeder received reports of near misses. The 406th Engineers, providing security, dug deep foxholes, but they could not hide the inflatables. The success of the mission required the decoys to remain visible, effectively acting as magnets for enemy steel. While the physical deception drew fire, the electronic deception drew attention. The signal company special, operating from concealed trucks, spun a web of lies into the electromagnetic spectrum. They were impersonating the command nets of the 30th and 79th Divisions. This required more than just transmitting encrypted gibberish. It required acting on the telegraph key. German signals intelligence was sophisticated. They could identify individual American radio operators by their fist, the unique rhythm and cadence of their typing. The Ghost Army operators mimicked these fists perfectly. They sent requests for bridging timber, fuel for armored columns, and ammunition reports. They created a traffic analysis picture that screamed of an imminent offensive. Reeder monitored the dummy traffic, knowing that every message sent was a breadcrumb leading the Germans to the wrong location. The spoof radio teams worked in shifts, maintaining the high volume of traffic expected from a corps-level preparation. They reported non-existent convoys moving into sector, detailed the locations of fake supply dumps, and coordinated air defense for empty skies. To the Germans listening in, the electronic footprint was indisputable. The Americans were here, and they were ready to cross. As night fell on the second day, Reeder authorized the escalation of the deception. It was not enough to look and sound like an army. They had to act like one preparing for violence. This meant simulating artillery registration. Teams from the Ghost Army set up flash canisters, pyrotechnic devices that simulated the muzzle flash of heavy artillery. Synced with the sonic projection of 150 mm howitzers firing, these flashes created the sensory illusion of a battery firing ranging shots across the river. The Germans, seeing the flashes, responded with counter-battery fire. The ground shook around Reeder's headquarters. The enemy was biting. They were shifting their heavy guns to suppress the American artillery at Viersen. Every German battery that turned its tubes toward Reeder's rubber guns was one less battery aiming at the real 9th Army crossing points to the north. But the intensity of the incoming fire was increasing. The Germans were not just harassing. They were trying to destroy the assembly area. By the night of March 21st, the situation was critical. Intelligence reports from Chef indicated that the deception was succeeding beyond expectations, perhaps too well. Major German units were observed moving. They were converging on the riverbank opposite Viersen, digging in to repel the assault they believed was hours away. Colonel Reeder stood in the center of the storm. His unit, lightly armed and spread thin, was now facing a concentrated German defense force. If the Germans decided to launch a spoiling attack across the river, a raid to disrupt the American preparations, they would find only inflated rubber and wire recorders. The 23rd would be overrun in minutes. A runner entered the tent with a new intercept. The German commanders were moving their reserves. The trap was set, but the Ghost Army was now the bait in a cage with a tiger, and the door was locked. The real crossing was scheduled to begin soon. But until then, Reeder and his men had to endure the focus of the entire German defensive line. The shelling intensified, walking closer to the command post. The illusion was holding, but the reality of 88mm shells was threatening to shatter it. To understand the calm at the center of the storm in Viersen, one must understand Colonel Harry Langdon Reeder. Born in 1891 in Ohio, Reeder was not a man of the theater or the arts. He was a professional soldier, a product of the rigid hierarchy of the pre-war army. He had graduated from St. John's College in Annapolis and had seen the horrors of trench warfare in France during World War I. His career had been built on the solid, unglamorous work of infantry tactics and training. Before being assigned to the 23rd, Reeder had commanded the 46th Armored Infantry Regiment. He was a man accustomed to steel and firepower, not balloons and sound effects. His selection to command the Ghost Army was a deliberate move by the Army brass. They did not need another creative type to lead the unit. They had plenty of those in the ranks. They needed a disciplinarian, a stabilizer, a man who could take a group of artists and turn them into a military unit that could function under fire. Reeder was the anchor. He provided the protective shell of military legitimacy that allowed his unorthodox subordinates to operate. He understood that for the deception to work, the unit had to look, act, and smell like a regular Army outfit, at least from the outside. The concept of the Ghost Army did not originate with Reeder. It was the brainchild of two very different officers, Major Ralph Ingersoll and Colonel Billy Harris. Ingersoll was a civilian celebrity in uniform, the former publisher of Time and Fortune magazines, a best-selling author, and a man with a flair for the dramatic. He was the wild idea man, the visionary who saw that the battlefield was a stage. Harris, a West Point graduate, was the pragmatist who knew how to navigate the labyrinth of Army bureaucracy. The inspiration came from the British. In 1942, during the Battle of El Alamein, the British employed Operation Bertram, using dummy tanks and camouflage to fool Rommel. Ingersoll and Harris saw the potential to industrialize this concept for the American Army. They envisioned a mobile, self-contained unit that could simulate not just a few tanks, but entire divisions. They pitched the idea to the highest levels of the Pentagon, arguing that in the bloody attrition of the Western Front, deception could save thousands of lives. The unit was activated on January 20, 1944, at Camp Forest, Tennessee. It was, from the beginning, a nut house, as some regular Army observers called it. The table of organization was a patchwork of 4 distinct subunits, each with a specialized skill set. 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, the Artists and Visual Deceivers. Signal Company Special, the Radio Spoofers. 31-32nd Signal Service Company, the Sonic Deceivers. 406th Engineer Combat Company, the Security Force, the Real, soldiers who protected the fake ones. Reeder's task at Camp Forest was to weld these disparate elements into a cohesive team. It was a clash of cultures. The men of the 603rd were recruited from art schools, Pratt, Cooper Union, the Cleveland Institute of Art. They were accustomed to studio life, not the parade ground. They sketched in their spare time, argued about cubism, and chafed under military discipline. The men of the 406th, combat engineers trained to fight and build, often looked askance at the artists they were guarding. Reeder had to bridge this gap, enforcing discipline while allowing the creative freedom necessary for the deception to evolve. At Camp Forest and later at Pine Camp, now Fort Drum, NY, the unit invented its doctrine from scratch. There were no field manuals for sonic deception or inflatable tank deployment. They had to figure out how to move the inflatables without tearing them, how to mix the soundtracks to sound realistic at distance, and how to coordinate radio scripts with visual movements. Reeder oversaw this chaotic experimentation. He watched as his men tested the inflatables, realizing that a rubber tank that didn't cast a shadow looked fake from the air. He listened to the sonic tests, learning that wind direction could ruin a deception. He began to understand that his command was not about firepower, but about information management. He was commanding a theater troupe where the audience was the German General Staff, and a bad performance meant death. The heart of the visual deception lay with the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion. These men were the set designers of the war. They utilized pneumatic decoys manufactured by U.S. Rubber and other companies. These were not simple balloons. They were complex structures made of rubberized fabric with internal bladders and PVC skeletons to hold the shape of turrets and guns. A standard M4 Sherman decoy packed down into a valise the size of a duffel bag. When deployed, it required a compressor to inflate. The artists of the 603rd, men like Bill Blass, Ellsworth Kelly, and Art Kane, applied their artistic training to the battlefield. They understood that the eye is lazy. A perfect tank looked fake. A real tank was dirty, covered in camouflage nets and surrounded by clutter. They developed techniques to garnish the decoys. They used real camouflage nets to obscure the rubber sheen. They used bulldozers to churn up the mud around the assembly areas, creating tank tracks that would be visible to aerial reconnaissance. They scattered empty oil drums, ration boxes, and even hung laundry lines between the fake tanks. The goal was to create a pattern of life that looked authentic from 5,000 feet. They even created dummy aircraft, L-5s, that were so light they had to be staked down to prevent them from blowing away in a stiff breeze, a training accident that occasionally provided moments of levity in an otherwise deadly serious business. Captain Fred Fox, a Princeton graduate with a flair for the dramatic, codified the unit's philosophy in a memo that became legendary within the 23rd. He urged the men to view their mission as a traveling road show. We must remember that we are playing to a very critical and attentive radio, ground, and aerial audience, he wrote. They must all be convinced. This led to the development of special effects, or atmosphere. This was pure acting. When the unit was impersonating a division, the men would sew the shoulder patches of that division onto their uniforms. They would stencil the bumper markings of the impersonated unit onto their jeeps and trucks. They would then drive into local towns, St. Lo, Luxembourg City, Bastogne, and make their presence known. They would visit cafes, order omelets, and complain loudly about their orders to move east or west. They spread rumors knowing that in the occupied and recently liberated territories, German spies and collaborators were everywhere. A loose comment in a bar about the 6th Armored moving out at dawn was often more effective than a radio transmission. It was dangerous work. Wearing false insignia could technically strip them of their Geneva Convention protections if captured, classifying them as spies. Yet they did it daily, embodying the role of the soldiers they were mimicking. In the downtime between missions, the artists of the 603rd did what artists do. They documented their world. Soldiers like Bill Blass and Arthur Shilstone filled sketchbooks with watercolors and ink drawings of French villages, refugees, and their fellow soldiers. These sketches, preserved today, offer a poignant counter-narrative to the mechanical deception. They show the humanity of the con artists, young men, far from home, using their talent to process the destruction around them. Blass, who would later define American fashion, sent his sketches of fashion designs home, dreaming of a career after the war, even as he inflated rubber tanks in the mud of Lorraine. While the 603rd handled the visual, the 31st Signal Service Company handled the visceral. Their weapon was sound. The concept was championed by Colonel Hilton Howell Rayleigh, a colorful figure who had been a journalist and a promoter for Amelia Earhart. Rayleigh worked with engineers from Bell Labs to develop the recording and projection technology. The technology was cutting edge. They utilized wire recorders, spools of hair-thin wire that could record and play back audio with higher fidelity than the phonograph discs of the time. The 31st Brackend traveled to Fort Knox to record the specific sounds of the American arsenal, the high-pitched whine of a Sherman tank engine, the heavy thrum of a half-track, the clanking of a bridge layer, and the rhythmic march of infantry boots. These sounds were mixed onto programs of up to 30 minutes. In the field, they were broadcast from sonic cars, M2 half-tracks equipped with massive banks of speakers. These speakers were heaters as well. The sheer power running through them meant they could melt if not properly ventilated. The sound could carry for 15 miles. A mobile weather station accompanied the unit measuring wind shear and humidity. The engineers used this data to adjust the gain and direction of the speakers, ensuring the sound arrived at the enemy lines with the correct volume to simulate a unit at a specific distance. They could make a tank column sound like it was approaching, passing, or retreating, simply by manipulating the faders. The signal company special provided the intellectual verification. If the Germans saw tanks and heard tanks, they would check their radio intercepts to confirm. If the radio spectrum was silent, they would suspect a trap. The radio operators of the Ghost Army were the elite of their trade. They engaged in spoof radio. This involved creating entire dummy radio networks. They would set up radios in a widely dispersed pattern to simulate the breadth of a division. They would then transmit scripted traffic. The key was the fist. A radio operator's tapping style is as unique as a fingerprint. German intelligence tracked units by following these specific operators. The Ghost Army operators practiced for hours to mimic the fists of the actual operators they were replacing. If they were impersonating the 6th Armored, they had to sound like the 6th Armored's operators. They sent administrative traffic, routine reports, and urgent operational messages, all coded, of course, but coded in a way that, when traffic analysis was applied, showed the pattern of a unit preparing for action. They maintained the illusion that the real unit was still in the area, long after it had secretly moved to a new attack position. The unit's capabilities were forged in the crucible of Operation Bedenburg in September 1944. This was not a drill. General Patton's Third Army had left a massive 70-mile gap in its lines near Metz while concentrating for an attack. The 23rd was ordered to plug a 20-mile sector of this gap. For 7 days, the Ghost Army held the line. They were 100 men pretending to be the 20,000 men of the 6th Armored Division. They were facing a hardened German force that could have punched through their thin line with ease. Reeder deployed the full multimedia package: rubber tanks in the forward positions, sonic trucks blasting tank noises at night, and aggressive radio traffic. The danger was extreme. German patrols probed the lines. American patrols, composed of 4th 6th engineers in jeeps with heavy machine guns, drove aggressively to simulate the recon elements of an armored division. They faced near misses daily. In one instance, a patrol ran into a German outpost and barely escaped, relying on the Germans' hesitation to fire on what they thought was the vanguard of a tank division. The deception worked. The Germans, convinced they were facing a fresh armored division, hunkered down and did not attack. Patton's flank was secure, saved by a bluff. We return to March 23, 1945. The bombardment at Viersen had continued for days. Colonel Reeder, exhausted but focused, watched the reports piling up. The deception had reached its zenith. The flash batteries were drawing heavy counterfire. The sonic trucks, churning through the mud, were playing the building bridge programs, convincing the Germans that the engineers were in the water. Across the Rhine, the German reaction was precisely what the Allies had hoped for, and what Reeder's men feared. German armored reserves were streaming toward Viersen. They were clogging the roads, moving into defensive positions to crush the Phantom crossing. The German High Command had swallowed the bait whole. They had committed their mobile reserve to a fight against ghosts. 10 miles to the north, under the cover of a massive artillery barrage, the real U.S. Ninth Army launched its assault. The first waves of infantry boats hit the water. They braced for the withering fire that had met the landings at Omaha Beach or the earlier attempts to cross the river. But the fire was light. The bunkers were undermanned. The tanks that should have been blasting the boats out of the water were sitting miles away, waiting for Reeder's rubber tanks to attack Viersen. The Ninth Army crossed the Rhine with casualties that were miraculously low. They established a bridgehead and began to pour armor into the German interior. General Simpson, the Ninth Army commander, would later tour the Ghost Army's positions. He was astounded. He saw the deflated tanks, the wire recorders, the weary artists who had held the attention of the Wehrmacht for a critical week. He issued a commendation to the 23rd, citing their careful planning, minute attention to detail, and diligent execution. They had not fired the decisive shots of the crossing, but they had ensured that those shots found their mark. With the Rhine crossed, the war in Europe raced toward its conclusion. The Ghost Army continued to operate, but Viersen was their masterpiece. When the war ended, the unit returned to the United States. But there were no parades for the Ghost Army. The Army, realizing the strategic value of the tactics developed by Reeder, Ingersoll, and the artists, slapped a top-secret classification on the entire unit. The men were sworn to secrecy. They could not tell their wives, their parents, or their children what they had done. They were told to say they had been in camouflage or supply. Colonel Harry Reeder commanded the unit until its deactivation. He died in 1947, his role in saving 30,000 American lives known only to a handful of men in the Pentagon. The artists, Bill Blass, Ellsworth Kelly, Art Kane, went on to define American culture in the 20th century, their wartime surrealism locked away in classified files. It was not until 1996 that the records were finally declassified. The story of the Ghost Army emerged from the shadows. In 2022, the unit was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, a final recognition for the combat con artists who proved that in war, the truth is so precious that it must always be attended by a bodyguard of lies.